Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti, benvenute e benvenuti. Eccoci alla seconda serata del nostro Festival Letterature, Tempo Nostro. Avete tutti la brochure, ma vi annuncio gli autori di questa serata. Cominceremo con Katie Kitamura, che leggerà l'inedito Mondo, diverso. Poi sarà la volta di Dacia Maraini, che leggerà le sue poesie sulla guerra. Rivka Galchen con Non dirlo a mamma e Colson Whitehead che leggerà l'inedito Il comico. Come sapete, questo festival quest'anno si caratterizza anche per la presenza di coreografie e musica dal vivo e la lettura degli inediti sarà intervallata da una coreografia di Salvo Lombardo+Daria Greco e Chiasma. La musica live sarà di Erika Galli e il video di Daniele Spanò. Io ringrazio tutti voi per essere qui con noi, grazie per essere così numerosi, grazie al Parco Archeologico del Colosseo che generosamente ci ospita in questa splendida cornice. Nel corso della prima serata abbiamo ringraziato il gruppo di lavoro e tutte le istituzioni partner, gli editori, le ambasciate, gli istituti di cultura che lavorano con noi e che ci hanno aiutato a costruire questo programma. Però ho dimenticato di ringraziare due persone che hanno contribuito in maniera importante al successo di questo festival, perché avrete visto che stanno uscendo tanti articoli sui giornali e tante interviste. E sono l'ufficio stampa Tandem, Francesca Comandini e Paola Turco. Le ringraziamo tanto e naturalmente ringraziamo sempre questo bellissimo gruppo di lavoro dell'istituzione Biblioteche, dell'assessorato alla cultura e Zetema Progetto Cultura, questo bel gruppo che ci ha aiutato a far diventare semplice tutto quello che a noi sembrava all'inizio difficile. Grazie a tutti e buona serata. Grazie.
Despite the imminent outbreak in our city, we had taken ourselves to a reading at a small bookshop by the waterfront. There were more people there than we thought there would be, and although by that point we had already been told not to shake hands, although we had been inundated with warnings not to touch our faces, people were embracing as though we were not on the verge of catastrophe. About the reading itself, I remember very little. In normal times, I would have enjoyed it, but these were not normal times. I was distracted. It had been weeks since I had slept well. At night, I was plagued by dreams of contamination. By day, I tracked the progress of the virus as slowly and then suddenly it made its way to our city. Now the first case had arrived, and we had been told that there were likely hundreds more still undiagnosed. After the reading, we stood around in clusters making small and idle talk. I don't remember when I first noticed the young woman. She had a very plain face. Even now, I would struggle to describe it in concrete terms. Mousy brown hair, medium height, quite large and expressive eyes. She had been standing a few feet away for some time, examining the bookshelves, before she suddenly introduced herself. "Excuse me," she said, "but do you know Alex O'Ray? I overheard you say that you were at Covington in October. He was there at the same time." I turned to the young woman. Red hair, tall, funny walk? The name was unfamiliar, and I had no immediate recollection of the person she described. But as she pantomimed the comic gait and manner of her friend, an image of a young man began to form in my mind, the hazy recollection of someone who might have been Alex O'Ray. "I'm not sure," I said sincerely, "but yes, probably. The name is familiar. Did he like Covington?" "Oh yes," she said. Her face and limbs were marvelously mobile. As she spoke, she flung her arms and hands about, occupying the air around us. He finished his manuscript, he made a bunch of friends, he lived in a beautiful place by the sea. "To be honest, it's hard not to be jealous," she said, lowering her voice. "I study HIV. There's only ever one update. It didn't work." She screwed up her face and gave a clownish shrug, and we laughed. She laughed too, quite loudly, and then my husband said, "So, you study infectious diseases. Can you talk to us about the virus?" "Oh, I can talk for sure," she said slowly. She raised a theatrical eyebrow. "But I don't want to bore you." "You won't bore us," he said. "Trust me." We leaned forward. She clasped her hands and began. "For the vast majority of people, it's nothing more than a cold. A headache, a sore throat, a bad flu at most. But for a percentage of people, it's much worse. It degrades into pneumonia, it results in hospitalization, and in some cases death." As she spoke, I felt a slow creep of impatience. She hadn't told me anything I didn't already know, nothing that couldn't be found in the course of a casual internet search, the kind I had been performing for days. As she began to rattle off the statistics that could be found on the website of a well-known university, my husband shifted his weight on his feet. She looked around the room and lowered her voice confidentially. "I would say right now in this room, 3 or 4 people are infected." I looked up. "Here, right now? But there are only 20 of us." As if of its own volition, my husband's hand crept into his pocket and withdrew a small bottle of hand sanitizer. She smiled then and leaned forward so that her face was mere inches from ours. I could feel her breath move through the air between us. "Exactly," she said. "The virus is everywhere. It's too late." We left the bookshop shortly after that. As I pushed the door open, touching the metal handle with my bare hand before brushing the hair out of my face, something that would soon become inconceivable, I turned and saw the young woman again. She was on the other side of the room, talking animatedly with a young man who worked in the bookshop, her big and buoyant gestures legible from a distance. "I can talk, for sure," I heard her say, "but I don't want to bore you." We stepped out into the cold air. I turned and looked back through the plate glass windows of the bookshop. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I saw the young man recoil. No doubt she was telling him that right now in that room, there were 3 or 4 people who were infected. We took the subway home. Those were the last cold days before the weather began to warm. As we stood in the crowded car, I said that I had a terrible headache. My husband told me that his throat was throbbing, and then we stared at each other in silence. By the next day, the number of cases in the city had tripled. By the following week, the city would be placed under a lockdown order. Later, many months later, we would come across people in the newly awakened city. People who, in the days before what we would come to refer to as the first wave of the pandemic, had also met a young woman with expressive features, an infectious disease specialist with a friend called Alex O'Ray. It had happened in bars, at gigs, at dinner parties and birthday gatherings. They all remembered her and her peculiarly named friend. The specific details of her biography were disputed. It had been the research hospital downtown rather than uptown. She had said Ebola and not AIDS. She had been visiting from Seattle or possibly San Francisco or Chicago. But we all remember the same lines spoken with such panache. "The virus is everywhere. It's too late. I don't want to bore you." I recalled her youth, her unprepossessing manner, the fact that she had told me nothing other than what I already knew. Had there been a certain relish to the way she had shared her calamitous prediction? Hadn't she been altogether too cheerful a Cassandra? But in those days, we were ravenous for information and all too credulous. What we craved in those long weeks and months and then years, what we were searching for was certainty. And certainty that young woman had. But for all the wild glee of her imagining, the glee that had made us and the young man in the bookshop and probably countless others recoil from her, for all that, she had not imagined enough. She had not imagined that the vaccines, once found, would only mitigate the effects of the virus rather than halt it completely. Nor had she envisioned the waves of the pandemic growing in frequency as a period of individual immunity seemed to grow shorter, or the surreal politicization of masks and vaccines in our country, or the vilification of public health officials. None of us had. And although people like to say the signs were there, if only knew where to look, the truth was that while some of us were looking, only a very small handful of us knew how to interpret the data. Much of the landscape that we live in defeats the imagination. It feels literally inconceivable. The scale of events, from climate change to war to 1 million dead from COVID-19 in the United States alone, is so large that it exceeds the grasp of our imagination. We fall back on numbers and statistics to communicate the vastness of the catastrophe, as we struggle to locate the language that expresses the urgency of what we know is taking place around us, but are still unable to fully envision. I was recently asked if I believe that in times of such urgent political and ecological disaster, literature still had a role to play. If I felt that my work was still worth doing. My honest answer is that I don't know, and that it doesn't always feel that way. I'm a writer. It is my job to observe the world as closely and as keenly as possible through the medium of language. But that world can sometimes feel hard to perceive, and the language can sometimes feel insufficient. And yet, I continue to believe that words matter. Language matters, because it is through language that we imagine new identities, positions, and possibilities. Today, around the world, language is contested and controlled precisely because it is through words that we not only see, but create the world we live in. Imagination does not live or exist without language, and it is imagination that allows us to see the world we live in and then change it. Earlier this year, almost 2 years after I met the young woman at the book party, I tested positive for the virus. I had managed to avoid infection for over 2 years, and when I finally tested positive, I stared at the second line on the test with mild incredulity that it had happened after so long, the inevitable. Following the now familiar advice, I isolated in the spare room away from my family for a period of 10 days. I was double vaccinated and I was boosted, but I was also anxious not to infect my husband and children. It is a curious thing to think of yourself as infectious. The word changes your relationship to your body and to the world. That change is not without significance. After 10 days, after I tested negative once and then twice, I emerged from my confinement. I did a simple thing. I went outside for a walk. I looked at the new leaves on the trees, the iron posts on the gate outside our home, the sunlight falling on all of it. I looked with such hunger that each detail was near blinding. It was not the same world as before.
Buonasera. Allora, io non sono una poetessa, io sono una raccontatrice di storie, però ogni tanto penso che alcune cose non si possono che dire in forma poetica, quindi mi perdonerete questa uscita dal mio campo per entrare in un altro campo. Questa si chiama Cosa resta del Mar Nero dopo la guerra. Ho immaginato che la guerra fosse già finita. Se quest'acqua ha una memoria, come dicono, ricorderà le notti di guerra e il pianto dei soldati morti, ricorderà il profumo stagnante dei gelsomini schiacciati e dei fucili oliati, ricorderà i pesci che accorrevano festosi alla luce degli aerei, ricorderà il dondolio delle navi di ferro dal forte odore di vernice fresca e le voci che risuonavano roche e lo strepitio delle mitragliatrici e il sibilo delle bombe mortali e il ridere di una bambina che si è accorta di aver perso una gamba, ma sa di essere ancora viva mentre i cadaveri vengono risucchiati dalle onde. Se quest'acqua ha una pelle, come dicono, sentirà il fiato delle stagioni che cambiano e saprà che la guerra è finita, ma i pesci non salgono più a galla a curiosare. Non c'è più un polipo in tutta la baia e le onde inodori trascinano pezzi di plastica e carogne di cani ammazzati. L'acqua sporca, l'acqua della memoria ferita, riconoscerà solo l'odore dell'odio che muore. Se quest'acqua ha un respiro, come dicono, avrà aspirato l'aria malsalmastra di un giorno di festa, avrà assorbito con riconoscenza il fresco vento del nord in una speranza di rinascita, avrà ingoiato i sapori della primavera che fa volare i pollini sulle onde, ma al posto del vento nuovo avrà inalato le amarezze di una guerra fraterna e ingoierà la memoria come un veleno tradito, chiedendosi come mai del fulgore delle sue acque, del dondolio delle sue alghe profumate, dei suoi quadrati di luce che danzavano sul fondale, non siano rimasti che quarti di carro armato, bombe non esplose, scarpe rotte e fucili arrugginiti. Grazie. Questa si chiama Spigole sott'acqua. Questa è un po' fuori dalla guerra, però ricorda tempi lontani del Giappone, quando c'era ancora mio padre e mia sorella. Ogni tanto, di notte, mi vengono a trovare, portano scarpe di pezza e non sanno camminare. Ma strano, davvero strano, sanno cantare. Hanno la voce delle spigole sott'acqua, come di chi conosce il suono delle rocce e della luna appena nata. Ogni tanto di notte mi vengono a trovare mia sorella dal collo di farfalla, mio padre dal sorriso di elefante. Non mi chiedono di rispondere, non mi chiedono di andare. Si seggono su un sasso come ai tempi delle grandi merende lungo il fiume di Karisawa e cantano, ma senza aprire la bocca, come le spigole sott'acqua. Questa invece, questa è una poesia che veramente non è scritta adesso. Le altre proprio sono inedite, non solo, ma le ho scritte adesso per la guerra. Questa invece è una poesia in morte, in onore, insomma, per la morte di Marco Biagi, vi ricordate, no? È del marzo 2002. Un uomo in bicicletta, i polsi leggeri, le scarpe di gomma, la sciarpa piumata, i pensieri che vorticano come moscerini ammattiti, pedala, vola, torna verso casa. Un uomo rientra in bicicletta, ha il fiato corto, un sospiro di paura sotto la lingua accaldata. È stato minacciato quest'uomo, è stato intimorito, ma le paure se le cacciate con coraggio nelle tasche della giacca, mute come stupide pietre straniere. L'inverno lo incalza l'allegria di una mattina di lavoro. Lo incalzano le gioie di un pranzo in famiglia. Un uomo in bicicletta corre, un arresto, uno schianto, un urlo, uno sparo. Ma dove? Perché? Chi ha tirato? Una mano giovane, un cuore freddo, un tumulto di rapide certezze, sbilenchi pensieri di vendetta. Chissà, di odio forse, di paure violente. Una misera mente ha colpito. Un uomo muore ma senza morire, perché la sua voce è lì chiara come un merlo estivo e lascia nell'aria serena le tracce precise di un pensiero, di un progetto, di un dolore, mentre le sue mani muoiono, i suoi piedi muoiono, un lenzuolo lo copre pietoso, il sangue oggi ha il colore delle notti senza luna, ha la tinta livida dei sogni troncati. Un uomo corre, vola, ma dove va? Che non ha più gambe per camminare, non ha più piedi per pedalare. Un uomo senza mani, senza piedi, con i pensieri che frullano come moscerini attirati dalla luce di un pensiero profondo. Continua a volare con la sua bicicletta, con le sue mani guantate, con la sua sciarpa piumata, con i suoi piedi impazienti. Un uomo continua ad andare e noi con lui. Questa invece l'ho scritta adesso, è inedita, l'ho scritta adesso proprio perché io non so voi, ma io sono molto impressionata da questa guerra, forse perché io l'ho vissuta, ero bambina ma l'ho vissuta, quindi per me vedere le immagini dei bombardamenti mi ricordano le paure che ho avuto da bambina quando mi nascondevo e volavano queste bombe e sempre con l'impressione che se la casa cadeva, anche se eravamo in un sotterraneo, si moriva soffocati come topi, insomma. Però questa è fiabesca, diciamo che è fiabesca. Ho incontrato un delfino, mi ha raccontato che nuotando si è scontrato muso a muso con un pesce marrone e viola che assomigliava a una balena, ma non era una balena. Non conosceva nessun linguaggio, ma parlava chiaro con i suoi muscoli d'oro. Qualcuno poi gli ha detto che era un siluro. Ho incontrato un gabbiano dalle lunghe ali d'argento. Mi ha raccontato che volando si è incontrato becco a becco con un uccello dal colore dei corvi marini, ma non era un corvo. Qualcuno poi gli ha detto che era una bomba marzolina. Ho incontrato un gatto dal muso tigrato bellissimo. Mi ha raccontato che mentre rincorreva un topo si è scontrato pelle a pelle con una rondella di ferro dall'odore acre e fumoso. Qualcuno poi gli ha detto che era una mina, ma lui non ha sentito perché è saltato per aria. Ho incontrato un cane che aveva perso il padrone, un cane bianco, nero, dagli occhi limpidi e puri. Correva in cerchio cercando e si è incontrato con una bicicletta sbilenca. Accanto c'era il corpo del suo amato padrone. Gli ha leccato la guancia gridando «Bentornato!», ma al posto degli occhi azzurri ha visto 2 buchi neri. Un rivolo di sangue gli rigava la guancia. Credo che questa è un po' diversa dalla fine. L'ho corretta. Questa è un'altra poesia scritta adesso, inedita, l'ho scritta apposta. Passa un treno lungo e veloce, corre smuovendo pietre e polvere. Passa un treno che rallenta le curve e vedo delle mani che si allungano per salutare. Sono mani bianche che gridano nell'aria smossa. Passa un treno lungo e gonfio, ha le ruote grandi di ferro, ha un muggito rabbioso di toro, ma dall'interno arrivano sospiri leggeri come ali di farfalla. Passa un treno tutto nero, ha le croste di antiche ferite sul tetto affumicato, ha i finestrini sporchi e macchiati, eppure ride il treno e saluta fischiando allegramente. Passa un treno dal muso appuntito, ha 2 occhi di fuoco che fissano il futuro per fermarlo un solo istante. È carico di donne, uomini e bambini, corpi trasparenti, nudi, senza peso. Passa un treno lento affaticato, attraversato la storia, e ora le sue ruote piangono di fatica. Ma pure qualcuno canta nel suo interno, è una voce di bambino. Passa un treno lento che forse si è addormentato secoli fa. Eppure quelle mani si sporgono, salutano e chiedono qualcosa che non si capisce, qualcosa che suona come una richiesta di aiuto. Passa un treno con mani che si agitano, sono mani bianche e azzurre, sono voci rosa e celesti. Solo quando è passato so che quel treno gentile portava dentro di sé un mucchio di corpi morti, corpi che da Mariupol andavano verso il mare di un domani senza casa e senza riposo. Ma qualcuno canta, è il canto dell'esilio, il canto della notte e dell'addio, il canto di un popolo che chiede con voce dolce e fervida, muta e severa: perché? 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 Grazie. Questa è l'ultima, si chiama, anche questa l'ho scritta adesso, si chiama Una bambina dal collo lungo. Una bambina dal collo lungo mi chiede pacifica, con voce severa: esiste secondo lei il male? Beh, rispondo di sì, il male esiste. La guerra è male? Sì, la guerra è male. E come si vince il male? La guardo e vedo le sue trecce che si fanno ali e lei si solleva puntando verso il basso le 2 scarpette rosse. Vola via la bambina dalla finestra, come un gabbiano dal collo lungo, bianco come la neve. Ma appena chiudo gli occhi, eccola davanti a me, il collo sempre più lungo, gli occhi accesi, color del carbone, mi guarda dolce e imperterrita incalza. Se Dio non ce la fa a vincere il male, come possiamo riuscirci noi? Premetto, faccio una parentesi, questo è un dialogo vero che ho avuto con una bambina in una scuola, per cui l'ho riportato, insomma, l'ho ricucita, ma è vera questa storia. Se Dio non ce la fa a vincere il male, come possiamo riuscirci noi? Vedo 2 angeli che scivolano alle sue spalle. Vogliono punirla per la sua arroganza, oppure abbracciarla e riempirla di baci, oppure strangolarla con le sue stesse trecce. Come si butta via il male? Questa è la domanda fatale. Le sue piccole dita di bambina insolente toccano le scaglie del mezzogiorno. Io sono muta, lei no, e continua. Si può fermare il male col male? È indomita la bambina e fa pensare al grillo di Pinocchio. Se uno mi mette un coltello sulla gola, posso prendere anch'io un coltello e infilzarlo? Insiste, ferma e decisa. Io le chiedo se rammenta le parole di un uomo coraggioso che ha suggerito di porgere l'altra guancia. Non ho 3 guance io, risponde l'insolente, ma pure il suo candore mi mette voglia di dire sì, hai ragione, non abbiamo 3 guance e dopo la seconda forse decidiamo di difenderci, anziché fare la fila dell'agnello. Il suo collo si allunga ancora, lo vedo puntare verso il cielo. Dall'alto mi arriva una voce che grida fra le nuvole: il male, amica mia, c'è, ma non ho più guance da dare. Dammi un sorso di pace, dammi un sorso di bene. Grazie, grazie, grazie per la vostra attenzione.
Wow. Mama, when I die, I want to die in Egypt. This is around 5:45 a.m., my 4-year-old daughter. I want to die in Egypt so that I can be a mummy, she clarifies. An autopilot parenting personality runs things for me at this hour. Mummies are great, I say. I love mummies. Mummies make other mummies with toilet paper, she says. Yes, autopilot me says. But I'm waking up, and my misguided, mom-splaining personality is taking over. I mean, mummies are dead people, I say. They are wrapped up by living people, not by other mummies. And it's not toilet. Mummies aren't dead. They're not alive. That's not true, she says, with high emotion. Then a pause, and she begins to cry. If I have to die, then I don't even want to exist. As a parent, I find that I spend a good amount of time talking about things that don't interest me, like My Little Pony, or when we're next having pasta, or death. At 3, my daughter became aware that at age 4, she would get another round of vaccinations. After 3 comes 5, she began declaring. There were also many, many tears anticipating the horror. Are there shots at 10? I'm going to turn 10. Eventually, she just started saying to anyone who didn't ask, I'm 5. I don't recall being interested in death as a child. I recall being interested in the television show Three's Company. My whole family was interested in the television show Three's Company. My father may have been the exception. He liked to visit the graveyard in our neighborhood, and he went to a screening of Shoah. But even when my father died, the rest of us stuck to our not talking about death principles. You won't find a photograph of my dad on the wall at my brother's apartment or at my mother's. We excel at ignoring ghosts and have practice at it. My maternal grandfather died before my mother was born. I never asked about him. I was never told. When I was 30 or so, a cousin informed me that his name was Oren. That's my brother's name. I then forgot that fact and then remembered. When my daughter was 2 years old, I overheard my friend, my own friend, talking to her about how leaves die in the fall. How reckless, I thought. Though I had recently brought her to a showing of The Wolf of Wall Street, no problem. Do you know anyone who has died? How many people have died? Are you going to die? I had been forced to admit to her that her grandfather was dead and that even that he had a name. I had not enjoyed that. But what about her? Does she move through life as if it were a mortuary? She proceeds to list everyone we know and love, inquiring like a prosecutor. Will this one die? Will that one die? I confess to the truth, person by person, feeling like an executioner. Mama, I have to tell you something. I'm worried. What is it? Letitia says she can cut her own nails now. A few weeks later, we have dinner at a friend's house. The friend's brother has just died. I don't think my daughter knows. There's a giant boxer-faced dog there under the table, gnawing on a rawhide bone. Did you ever give a dog a bone, Mama? I said that as a little girl, I had a dog who loved bones. I had another dog in college who... Are they died now, those dogs? Fair enough. I have a strong childhood memory of my mother removing the cluttered kitchen drawer from under the Kermit the Frog telephone. She removed that drawer and shook its entire contents into a garbage bag. Terrible. I was fond of opening that drawer, knowing that anything could turn up. A pink auto insurance keychain, a plastic watch not ticking, a scrap of paper that read Bears, Robin Hood. I will always let the clutter live, I thought. I will always be open to these surprises. These days, I love an empty drawer. The day after the dog and death dinner, I mentioned to my daughter on the subway ride home that we're going to stop by to see Papa at a coffee shop. Papa is there meeting with a friend he hasn't seen in a long, long time, I explain, so it will be nice. She's really lucky to still be alive, right? It's a beautiful day. The friend is there with, I have been told in advance, her new boyfriend. The couple gives off that kind of happiness that makes people seem inarguably good-looking. I get my daughter an enormous chocolate chip cookie. When I break off a piece of the cookie for myself, she growls at me. Meanwhile, I'm catching bits of a story. One thing that brought these two people together is that they both had dead spouses. That was an important connection. Another friend of theirs, who also had a dead spouse, married someone who did not have a dead spouse. My daughter has chocolate smeared all around her face, like a lion cub at the carcass. The children of this other man with the dead spouse who married someone without a dead spouse don't even know about their father's dead wife, and they're teenagers. This is not good, we all agree. The new boyfriend says, you need someone who will let the ghost be in the room. There he is suddenly, a vision of my father. He's watching the Rockford Files, and then Kojak on TV as I fall asleep on the living room sofa, so that I can be in the same room as he is. There he is again, telling me to orient the map first, and I am disagreeing really passionately. No, you don't have to orient the map. Yes, we all learn from our children, but what do we learn? Why is it so often something that they don't even know about themselves? When my daughter finally did turn 4, when the doctor's visit with vaccinations, which she had been working for what seemed to me years to avoid, actually happened, she surprised me. She looked coolly at her right arm as she received 2 shots, then coolly at her left as she received another 2. She didn't cry, she didn't flinch, she was just interested. She also calls Hershey's Kisses Hershey's Curses. Take it to mean what you will. Her favorite conflict resolution strategy isn't too bad either. Mama, she says, let's not chat about this anymore.
Howdy do. The comedian. One time on a talk show, before he made the change in his comedy, the comedian was asked why he started telling jokes. He took a sip from his mug and responded that he just wanted some attention. As a child, he'd felt unseen. Common expressions of affection eluded him. His mother told him, "Hush now," when he came to her with his needs or questions, and he frowned and padded off quietly. He received a measly portion of affirmation from grandparents, elderly neighbors, and wizened aunts who never married, folks who were practically in the affirmation of children business. Even schoolyard bullies were stingy with physical abuse and demeaning nicknames. The comedian believed that he was unseen, overlooked, and not perceived to a greater extent than other people were unseen, overlooked, and not perceived. In actuality, he was overlooked as much as everyone else. He just felt it more keenly. The talk show host asked him what his first joke was. He said he didn't remember, but he must have liked what happened because he did it again. The boy practiced and practiced. In the bathroom down the hall, he made funny faces before the white hexagonal tile. He devised oddball catchphrases and made unlikely connections between seemingly dissimilar objects and phenomena. When he later shoehorned these observations into conversation, people laughed. He experimented with metaphor and figurative language, like when a mouse died in the walls and no one could get to it, he said, "That smells like 100 Roger farts." They were having holiday dinner, the far-flung generations, and the vulgarity cracked everyone up, even Roger. He broke it down later, staring at the ceiling of his room while the grown-ups whipped it up in the living room downstairs. A familiar situation disrupted by an unexpected and forbidden element produced laughter. The smell of the decomposing mouse was not one Roger fart, but 100. Exaggeration was key. Exaggeration was a kind of truth-telling, and it made people laugh. If he made someone chuckle or snicker, he took notes and tried to recreate the circumstances later. The comedian expanded his act. He needed weapons. Other people were an army straying into his territories, and he prepared for war. He gathered specific put-downs for use against his friends and family in case they suddenly turned on him, which happened from time to time. He stole jokes from comics he saw on television and didn't give credit. Years later, he'd make ridiculous apologies to these men who were flattered to be remembered and boasted of their influence on him to their grandchildren on their infrequent visits. The comedian learned how to get girls by making them laugh and blush. He'd whisper in a girl's ear and she'd giggle and shake her head in sweet outrage. Guys who really wanted to beat him up were disarmed by some weird baboon face of his, and he forgot all about it. Look at me, look at me. He got into the local college and joined an improvisational comedy troupe. The group's flyers were everywhere, stapled to utility poles and taped to the doors of lecture halls, next to the ones from the a cappella groups. How strange it was, he thought, to be in an a cappella group and to advertise it. Improv was not his forte, group interaction in general, frankly. The audience yelled out words, cantaloupe, rooster, shoelace, and it was the comedy group's job to construct a jokey situation from them. They kidnapped these mundane things from the familiar and smuggled them into the realm of the absurd. Success was measured by the distance between the original context and the new alien context of the sketch. The comedian, however, didn't believe things had to travel very far to be funny or sad. You could look at pretty much anything and say, how laughable, or what a pity. He went solo. He practiced, and his bits became routines. At open mics, he did impressions of a previous generation's celebrities. They were really impressions of other people's impressions, stuff he got from television. Whenever he needed to stretch out a set and riff for a few minutes, he could rely on the voices of these dead people inside him. The comedian developed a character named Danny the dentist, who liked to interrogate his patients while their mouths were filled and stuffed with metal and latex. As Danny parsed their grunts, "I totally agree. Never let an encyclopedia salesman use your commode on a weekend." The humor derived from the contrast between the patient's nonsense syllables and his extravagant interpretations. It was kind of a commentary on the comedian's lot, to translate between the world as it is and the world as people perceive it. The character caught on, and in a few years he'd do Danny on variety shows and cable programs. When they bring out the old footage for the occasional documentary on the history of comedy or a ranking of the top 25 stand-ups according to a poll, it's always a shock to see Danny. It's like hearing about some backward medieval practice. You can't believe people used to live like that. He got his diploma because he didn't want to let anyone down and because a graduation ceremony was an opportunity to get attention from those he needed attention from. He wasn't disappointed with regard to their attendance. His family showed up and they all went out to lunch. They asked, "What are you gonna do now?" He hit the clubs and expanded his routine. He cut jokes. Why did he ever think that corny bit was funny? "This is my new style," he told himself, and 6 months later the new style was out the window and the next took its place. The old jokes testified to how stupid he'd been. But if people had laughed, what did that say about people? Local comedy clubs gave him slots and he started hanging out with his peers. The other comics weren't threatened. He wasn't exactly pushing the boundaries. Like, in one of his bits, 3 representatives of 3 different religious faiths were trapped in an isolated place where their differences were struck into sharp relief. Or he closed his act with the observation that one group of people tended to do things differently than another group of people, and he listed a few examples. Word came down that a scout from the big late-night talk show was going to check out the scene, and everybody worried and fussed. The scout frowned throughout the comedian's set. A month later, when they went out for drinks after his appearance on the talk show, the scout told him, "I try to laugh on the inside." This was the start of his celebrity. They flew him around the country. He got a manager and learned how to pack efficiently. He didn't have what you call a distinctive style, but he ran the bases, and that was enough. Even if they had a hard time remembering his name afterward. He played bigger and bigger rooms. He came up with new characters, like the limo driver. The limo driver was always sticking his nose into his passengers' affairs, hilariously clueless about his lack of boundaries. A Hollywood producer proposed a limo driver movie, but the comedian passed. He didn't like make-believe. Even when the limo driver exaggerated some human weakness, he didn't think he was stretching the truth. The comedian enjoyed the money and flattery that was thousands of people listening to his every word. His girlfriend moved into his condo, and that was a period he always looked back upon fondly, even if it didn't work out in the end, for a lot of reasons. He was never around. Every new city and gig was a chance to get it right, finally, somehow, in some small way, and nothing could compete with that. When he thought back on the day he changed his comedy, he never came up with an explanation. He'd been on a good run, and it was just another gig. He was in an American city of a certain size, the kind where if you were a B-list comedian, there was only one venue for you to perform in, and he was performing on its stage. He was halfway through his act, up there doing Danny the dentist. Danny was elbow deep in the mouth of a German tourist who'd been in a Wiener Schnitzel accident. The bit had a long and Baroque setup. As the comedian said the words he'd said 100 times before, he heard a high-pitched whistling in his ears. No one else seemed to notice it, and he thought for a minute that it was another one of his mysterious physical or mental symptoms, but quickly understood it was more than that. He stopped speaking and looked into the audience. They were a hive of faces before him, still and attentive, arranged like hexagonal tile in a bathroom. The comedian said the words that popped into his head. If I had known what little came from talking to other people, I never would have learned to speak. The microphone dispatched these words into the void of the auditorium. They laughed. They laughed for a nice, comfortable while. The comedian resumed his act, poor Danny, poor German tourist, but he knew something had changed. The next night, 1,000 miles away, he shared another one of his confidences with the audience, and they ate it up. He shared more and more of his confidences with the people who came to see him, and after 2 weeks, they had become his whole set. The confidences crowding out Danny the dentist, the limo driver, the stuttering hooker, stepping on their lines and hogging the spotlight until they stopped showing up. Out of habit, he persisted with the tools of the trade, the crooked eyebrows, the head wagging, the shrugs, not trusting people to understand his new message. But they did understand. One by one, the gestures fell away. He left them behind in city after city until his act was unadorned by the traditional flourishes of comedy, the nudges and cues the jester uses to herd the audience to laughter. They were no longer necessary. He couldn't walk down the street anymore. His first concert film broke a lot of records and made him a millionaire. The videos were popular among those who'd seen him in person and, late at night, needed to relive his confidences. His voice brought them back. When other comics tried to rip off his style, they discovered that the comedian was impossible to copy. Something was lost. It was in him. His new shtick fell into two areas. Everything is terrible. People are disappointing. To his notion of the terrible, there were a variety of responses. Some were relieved. If everything is terrible, then the only thing distinguishing one idea, object, or course of action from another is its degree of terribleness. This is obviously more terrible than that, and once the assessment was made, there was no need to belabor the point. It saved a lot of time. Some people were grateful. Let's stop pretending, the comedian said. Isn't it all so tedious and wearying, pretending that the world is other than that which it is, namely terrible? We walk around, gibber at each other, share our dreams and hopes in order to change the subject, but we all know what's going on. We know what we're avoiding with all this food, fucking, weekend getaways, and try some of this, you'll like it. Now there was this man before them just saying it. Things are terrible. They've been terrible for a long time. In fact, they've always been terrible. And the more people there are in the world implementing their awful imaginations, the more rapidly things get more terrible. He was the perfect older brother or sister or parent they'd always been waiting for, the one who set them straight, told them how to do it, reserving all the mistakes for themselves, sparing us. People are disappointing, needs no elaboration. Observational humor was a sturdy genre. Why is it when I describe this everyday situation in a certain way, it epitomizes life's frustrations? But the comedian's new brand required no rhetorical dressing up. It only needed to be shared. For so many years, the comedian had believed that a lack of attention had been a sadness particular to himself, when in fact, it was universal. Everyone had it. Everyone hid it. No one spoke of it until now. He was the only guy I know, recalled one of his contemporaries, who didn't have any hecklers. Many performers describe a rush or exhilaration following a show, a quickening. Not the comedian. Before he changed his comedy, sure, he was excited that People listened to him and saw him, thus proving that he did, in fact, exist. But after his new routines, he experienced none of that. He walked off stage but couldn't help feeling he was still on stage, with a glass of water and a wooden stool and nothing else, surrounded by darkness. He got used to it. "You're a different person on stage," they said. He thought no. After a lifetime of the reverse, that's the real me up there, and the rest of the time I'm performing. In this, he captured a feeling common to many artists, although he was loath to call himself an artist. He was simply telling the truth, and that's not art, is it? The years passed. Eventually, the novelty of his confidences wore off. He still sold out the house, but the lovely enthusiasm of that early wave was long gone. One day, he called it quits. He'd said all he had to say. He wasn't hurting for money, and for a time, he traveled to the places he'd always wanted to go. The comedian finally saw the world. It was more or less as he expected, not disappointing in any novel way. His new life was quiet, and he liked it. He felt better about things, having got it all off his chest. There had never been anything setting him apart from other people. The audiences proved it. They had been made of the same stuff all along. He retired to a small town up the coast where he shacked up with a woman who had her own business selling shawls and quilts to summer people. They got along okay. He played in the town once, long before, when he was just starting out. It seemed like the whole town showed up that night, filling the old theater and hooting and applauding. It was the kind of place where people know that life is hard, and sometimes what we need at the end of a long day, most of all, is a good laugh. Thank you.
Secondo.